6:32, let's bring you this story now. Calls to have the selection process for the new NYDA board reviewed are gaining momentum. That process has been criticized as predetermined, unfair and unconstitutional, with a noticeable political party imbalance among the recommended candidates. Now, MPs have raised concerns about the transparency of the scoring and the selection process of candidates. But despite this, the Joint Committee released the list of candidates for the board. Let's unpack the story now with DA Youth MP Luyolo Mpithi, who was part of that selection process. Luyolo, good morning. Thanks very much for your time on the AM report. I mean, this issue around the NYDA board and the candidates that are selected for the board, it's been an ongoing issue for so many years now. Is there anything about this latest list now that we know has been sent to the board that we can take heart to, that this process is changing?
Thank you, and good morning to you and your listeners in studio. Yes, this process has been marred by a lot of inaccuracies, a lot of ways of not being transparent. And I think the gist of it is that when you look at the recommended candidates, you see a very striking matter, the matter being that 6 of the 7 candidates have strong ties to the ANC. But besides that, when you look at the NYDA Act, in Section 9, subsection 4, it speaks quite clearly about how the board needs to be composed. And it says there that it needs to reflect the demographics of South Africa. It needs to have a geographical spread across the country in order to ensure that the board members have a good idea of what is happening within the provinces and are able to articulate the strategy of the NYDA in developing young people in each province. And so what you then see is that the current recommended names fail to meet Section 9(4) of the NYDA Act. But above and beyond that, you see a very strong link to politically connected cadres being rewarded with positions within the NYDA board, which does not do well for young South Africans in this country.
Luyolo, just let's take a step back for a moment and take us through how this list of candidates is nominated. Who is allowed to make those nominations? Just take us through that process.
Sure. Well, young people are able to nominate themselves, or organizations, youth organizations are able to make nominations of young people across the country. And so when the process began, we had received 680 applications that made their way through to the subcommittee. The subcommittee then began its process to shortlist from that 680, 30 names who would then go on to the interview process, which happened not so long ago.
And who is part of that interview process?
So the interview process consists of the subcommittee, which is essentially members that have been elected by the Portfolio Committee of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, as well as the NCOP Select Committee of Health and Social Services. There we then had 6 members of the ANC MPs, 4 from the National Assembly, 2 from the NCOP, 1 from the DA from the National Assembly, and 1 from the NCOP, and 1 member of the EFF. Yeah. And then that then composed the subcommittee that then did the interviews for the shortlisted candidates.
So the composition of the subcommittee is very much a reflection of the seats in the National Assembly in many ways.
Yes, it is proportional based on the seats that political parties have received in the 2019 election.
So how do we take this a step back? I mean, it can't come as just a convenient happening that 6 of the candidates are linked very strongly to the governing party. How do we ensure that the candidates are selected not, if that is the case, not for their political links, not for the province that they come from, because I see that most of the candidates are in fact from Gauteng, 1 candidate is from the Western Cape and another from KZN, but not for any of those connections, but for what they can bring to the NYDA, whose mandate is now more important than ever, given the joblessness numbers among the various other challenges facing young people in the country?
I think what has been very concerning in this process is the letter that has surfaced on social media and different platforms that details the National Youth Toss team of the ANC Youth League writing to the Deputy Secretary General of the ANC, stating that these are the recommended names that should be considered to serve on the board. And I think that was the first red flag that this process has seen, because we did see that it was a predetermined process in which these names were being named. But I think above and beyond that, the second problem was to see that majority of the recommended names come from Gauteng. And we've known historically that the NYDA has failed to reach young people in rural areas, has failed to disperse funds to young entrepreneurs in rural areas because of lack of offices and a lack of a digital footprint, but as well as a physical footprint in these communities. And so to see the majority of these recommended names coming from Gauteng raises flags, because the majority of young people in rural areas are being left out once again. But I think what is important here and what needs to be considered is Section 10 of the NYDA Act, which speaks about the disqualification of candidates. And I think there's been a lot of talk about amending that particular section to stop members of political parties who hold senior political positions in their parties from occupying the NYDA board, to stop the politically connected from being able to use the NYDA to loot. And this is what we know historically from the NYDA, that millions of rands have gone to waste. You look at the tombstone that was erected by the former board chairperson Fiso Mthweni, and he put his name on the tombstone. You look at the kissing festivals in the early 2010, where millions were wasted on a festival for what was deemed to be for young people, when it in fact was not. So we know that historically the NYDA has failed to deliver on the development of young people in this country, has failed to deliver on ensuring that young people have funds to start businesses and also create sustainable ventures in which they can assist the economy of this country. So when you look at all these factors, together with the legislation that has been broken and really violated by these recommended names, you then see the bigger problem that we face with the NYDA, which is supposed to be an institution that is supposed to develop young people, get young people to universities through bursaries, assist young people in TVET colleges with information and resources. So we indeed do have a problem with this recommended list. We indeed have a really striking resemblance of those who are politically connected being rewarded by being appointed onto this NYDA board. And therefore the objectivitiness and the impartiality that the subcommittee had to have to conduct this process is in question at the moment.
Yeah, it certainly does appear so, just given the issues that you've outlined. So these calls now to have this selection process set aside, these calls are gaining momentum. There is also that letter to the President and to the Speaker, Thandi Modise, calling for the board appointment process to be dissolved. As these calls gain momentum, is there any communication from the Presidency, from the Speaker, about whether these calls will receive urgent attention, just given, as you've outlined, the importance now of the NYDA?
Well, there's been no communication as yet from the Speaker of the National Assembly. But I have received a petition yesterday over 1,000 names of young people who have signed in objection to the recommended names. I will be sending that petition directly to the Speaker of the National Assembly to raise the voices of young people who have contested these recommended names. But also what I will be doing is I will be taking that petition to the Portfolio Committee of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, again to raise to the chairperson the voices of young people who have fundamentally raised the fact that there is no representation in terms of the recommended names. There is no person, who has been put representing persons with living with disabilities, and that is a huge issue, as well as the LGBTIQ community that has been left out again from this process. Again, another group of young South Africans being left voiceless in this entire process. So it is not over. The report will be debated in Parliament. Political parties will have the opportunity to raise their voices. But I think what is important now is that the call to the Speaker of the National Assembly is for her to recognize the voices of young people in this country and give them a response, because they have called on her on many occasions throughout this process to speak up and to respond to the issues that young people are facing in this country. Yeah. And therefore we are asking the National Speaker to speak up and to accept the voices of young people in this country.
Luyolo Mpithi, DA Youth MP, thanks very much for your time on the AM report. It certainly does appear that the process to appoint the NYDA board is deeply, deeply flawed. This is a story that we will keep tabs on and that is developing.